In the quiet town of Arlington, a peaceful drive home turned into a test of courage and justice when flashing red and blue lights appeared in Nathan's rearview mirror. It was a calm Sunday evening in the small town of Arlington, Mississippi, a place where the pace of life seemed slower, but beneath the surface unspoken tensions simmered. A middle-aged man named Nathan Williams was driving home with his 8-year-old nephew Malik after spending the afternoon fishing at a nearby lake. Nathan, a quiet man with a powerful presence, was the kind of person you'd notice in a room, even if he didn't say a word. His years in the Marines had given him a disciplined demeanor, but he'd long since left that life behind, choosing instead to focus on family and peace. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows on the 2-lane road, as Malik chatted away in the back seat, proudly holding up a small fish they had caught. Nathan smiled through the rearview mirror, his voice steady and warm, as he humored the boy's excitement. The road was almost empty, save for the occasional pickup truck rolling by, and Nathan was content in this moment of simplicity. But as he passed a rusted sign marking the town limits, he noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. His stomach tightened, not out of fear, but because he recognized what these lights often meant. In this town, he eased the car to the side of the road, instructing Malik to stay calm and keep quiet. The police cruiser pulled up behind him, and 2 officers stepped out. One tall and wiry, the other stocky, with a swagger that suggested he enjoyed throwing his weight around. Nathan kept his hands on the wheel, his every movement deliberate and visible. Years of experience had taught him how to stay composed. In situations like this, license and registration, the stocky officer barked, his tone laced with hostility. Nathan nodded and calmly reached for his wallet, handing over his ID and the car's paperwork. "You in a hurry or something?" the wiry officer added, circling the car like a predator sizing up its prey. "No, sir," Nathan replied evenly, "just heading home." The stocky cop squinted at Nathan's ID, his lips curling into a smirk. "Nathan Williams, huh? You sure you belong around here?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure if the officer wanted an answer or just an excuse to escalate the situation. Instead, he met the officer's gaze through the window, his expression neutral but unyielding. But something about the way the officers exchanged glances hinted that this stop was going to be more than routine. The stocky officer handed Nathan's ID to his partner, who retreated to the cruiser to run a check. The silence between Nathan and the remaining officer was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the police radio. Malik fidgeted in the back seat, his small fingers gripping the edge of his seat, as he whispered, "Uncle Nathan, are we in trouble?" Nathan turned his head slightly, keeping his hands visible. His voice was steady. "No, Malik. Just stay quiet, okay?" The officer's eyes flicked to the boy, then back to Nathan. "Got yourself a little passenger there, huh? Where are you coming from?" "Fishing," Nathan replied, his tone as plain as the officer's was probing. He didn't volunteer any extra details. He knew better than to give them more ammunition. The wiry officer returned, shaking his head. "Nothing on him," he said, almost disappointed. "Well, isn't that a surprise?" the stocky cop sneered, leaning closer to the driver's side window. "Thin is your brake lights out?" "You know that." Nathan frowned but kept his voice level. "It was working fine earlier." "Are you sure?" the officer's smirk widened. "Are you questioning me?" Nathan held his gaze unblinking. "Not at all, sir. Just saying it was working when I checked." The officer straightened up and tapped the roof of the car. "Step out of the vehicle." Nathan's jaw tightened, but he complied, opening the door slowly and stepping onto the gravel shoulder. He didn't want to escalate things, especially with Moloch watching. The officers weren't just looking for violations. They were fishing for something else. And Nathan could feel it as he stood by the car. The stocky cop gestured toward Moloch. Cute kid, shame if he had to see something unpleasant. Nathan's hands instinctively balled into fists, but he unclenched them just as quickly. His voice was low, controlled. There's no need to involve him in this. Oh, we'll decide what needs to happen here. The wiry cop snapped, circling around to the passenger side. He opened the door, startling Moloch. Step out, kid. Number, Nathan said firmly. Stepping forward, he's a child. He stays in the car. The two officers exchanged a glance, their smug expressions faltering for a brief moment. Nathan's calm but commanding tone caught them off guard. They weren't dealing with someone who would cower or panic. They were dealing with someone who understood how to hold his ground without giving them an excuse to escalate. But the officers weren't ready to back down. They were just getting started. The air grew heavier as the officers doubled down, their power play shifting into high gear. The wiry cop slammed the passenger door shut with a loud thud, but not before glaring at Moloch. The boy shrank back into his seat, clutching the fishing rod like a lifeline. The stocky officer crossed his arms, stepping into Nathan's personal space. You got a problem following orders, Mr. Williams? Or maybe you think you're smarter than us? Nathan didn't flinch. He stood tall, his hands relaxed by his sides, his voice calm but firm. I don't want any trouble. I just want to get my nephew home. The stocky cop chuckled darkly. Trouble? Oh, you're making it real clear. You don't understand who's in charge here. Nathan took a slow breath, his mind racing through scenarios. He could feel the weight of Moloch's wide-eyed stare through the window. This wasn't just about him anymore. Moloch needed to see what strength looked like, even in the face of injustice. Let me make it easy for you, the wiry cop said, joining his partner. He leaned in close, his tone dripping with mockery. Step back over to your car, hands on the hood. Let's see if you've got anything you shouldn't. Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he did as instructed. Placing his hands on the car's sun-warmed surface, his mind flashed back to his training. Control the situation, assess every variable, and always stay one step ahead. The pat-down began, more invasive than necessary. The wiry cop grinned as he made a show of slapping Nathan's pockets, pulling out his phone and wallet, and tossing them onto the hood. You're awful quiet, the stocky officer said, leaning close to Nathan's ear. That's not guilt I'm smelling, is it? Nathan turned his head slightly, his voice steady, its restraint. The officer's smirk faltered for just a moment, a crack in the facade, but he quickly recovered, grabbing Nathan's wallet and flipping through it. Marine hat. That's supposed to impress me. Nathan didn't respond. He'd learned it long ago. That silence could be louder than words. But then the wiry cop crossed the line. He opened the back door and gestured for Moloch to step out. The boy hesitated, his small frame trembling, as his wide eyes darted between his uncle and the officer. Leave him alone, Nathan said sharply, straightening up. His tone was like a blade, cutting through the officer's false bravado. The wiry cop grinned, clearly enjoying the reaction. What's the matter, tough guy? You're not in charge here. I am. The stocky cop moved closer to Nathan, his hand hovering near his holster. You don't want to make this worse for yourself, Marine. You're on thin ice. Nathan's fists clenched at his sides, his breath slow and deliberate. He wasn't afraid, but he was calculating. Years of discipline had taught him how to control his emotions, even in situations like this. But when Moloch let out a scared sob, something inside Nathan shifted. A quiet line had been crossed, and there would be no going back. Nathan's eyes locked on Moloch, whose trembling lips and tear-filled eyes ignited something deep within him, a protective instinct honed by years of service. and a lifetime of knowing the world wasn't always fair. Nathan knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about teaching Moloch what it meant to stand tall, even when the odds were stacked against you. Step away from him, Nathan said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made both officers pause. There was no yelling, no bravado, just the kind of authority that comes from knowing you don't need to prove anything to anyone. The wiry officer smirked, though his confidence wavered. Or what you gonna show us your marine tricks, tough guy? Nathan didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, positioning himself squarely between Moloch and the officers. His movements were slow and deliberate, every inch calculated to de-escalate without conceding ground. Moloch, stay in the car, Nathan said firmly, not taking his eyes off the cops. The boy hesitated but nodded, retreating into the seat and closing the door behind him. The stocky officer's hand now rested opally on his holster. You're real close to resisting, Marine. You want to see how far we'll take this? Nathan tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. You've already gone far enough. The silence that followed was electric, the kind that makes even the boldest man second-guess his choices. The wiry officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his partner for guidance. Then, in a move so quick it seemed almost effortless, Nathan reached out and plucked the wallet from the stocky officer's hand, tossing it onto the hood of his car. The motion wasn't aggressive. It was precise, controlled, and enough to send a clear message. He wasn't playing their game anymore. Let me be clear, Nathan said, his voice steady and calm. I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to argue. But I will not let you intimidate a child. To prove your authority. The stocky officer's face reddened, his composure cracking. You don't give the orders here, he barked, stepping closer. Nathan didn't move, his stillness somehow more powerful than any gesture. His eyes bore into the officer's, unflinching. You're right, I don't give orders, but I also don't take them from men who abuse their badges. The wiry cop reached for Nathan's arm, clearly trying to regain control of the situation, but Nathan sidestepped the grab with an ease that sent the officer stumbling forward, his balance faltering. Nathan didn't strike or shove. He simply moved out of the way, his actions fluid and deliberate. The stocky officer pulled his radio to his mouth, barking something about backup, but Nathan didn't seem fazed. Instead, he stood tall, his presence alone enough to command attention. But what happened next would change the course of the confrontation in a way no one could have predicted. The stocky officer's voice crackled over the radio as he called for backup, his tone a mix of anger and desperation. The tension was palpable, but Nathan remained calm, his gaze steady and unyielding. He knew the situation was spiraling, and the next few moments would determine everything. It was then that Moloch, still inside the car, did something neither the officers nor Nathan expected. The boy, with trembling hands, reached for Nathan's phone, which had been tossed onto the hood earlier. He unlocked it. Nathan had shown him how in case of emergencies, and pressed the record button. Through the crack in the window, he held the phone low, capturing everything Moloch. Nathan said softly, his tone a warning, but it was too late. The wiry cop spotted the movement and stepped toward the car. What's that kid doing? He barked, but his voice betrayed a flicker of panic. Nathan stepped into the officer's path, his broad shoulders blocking the man's approach. He's doing what you're afraid of, making sure the truth comes out. The stocky cop's hand twitched near his holster, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the unfolding situation. You think you're smarter, think you can outsmart the system. Nathan's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not one of amusement but of confidence. I don't have to outsmart the system. I just have to let the system see you for who you really are. The wiry cop lunged for Nathan, but his movements were sloppy, driven by frustration rather than skill. Nathan sidestepped again, this time grabbing the man's wrist in a firm but controlled grip. He didn't twist or pull, just held the officer steady, his voice calm. "You don't want to do this." The officer froze, his face twisting in humiliation. Nathan released his grip, his movements measured and deliberate. "You've already lost control. Don't make it worse." Meanwhile, Malik's phone continued to record, capturing every word, every gesture. The stocky officer barked again into the radio, but this time, his tone was less commanding and more frantic. He glanced toward the road, hoping for the sound of sirens, but none came. It was just them, standing on a quiet stretch of highway with the truth spilling out for anyone to see. Nathan took a step back, his hands raised slightly. "This can end right here. No one has to get hurt. But if you keep pushing, you're going to find out that the power you think you have doesn't go as far as you believe." The stocky cop's face reddened further, his chest heaving, as he struggled to regain the upper hand. But then, the wiry officer muttered something under his breath. "This is gonna get us fired." Nathan caught the words, his expression softening just slightly. "It's not too late to do the right thing," he said. "You can walk away from this." But the question wasn't whether Nathan could stand his ground. It was whether the officers would make the right choice, or dig themselves even deeper. The sound of distant sirens finally broke the tense silence, but the dynamic had already shifted. The stocky officer's hand twitched nervously near his holster, and the wiry cop's eyes darted between Nathan and the approaching lights. Their confidence was unraveling piece by piece. Nathan stood his ground, his expression calm but firm, every movement deliberate. He glanced at Malik, who was still clutching the phone, and gave him a small nod. The boy's grip relaxed slightly, but he kept recording, the quiet bravery of his actions shining in that moment. The first patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing, and two officers stepped out. These weren't the type to swagger or bark orders. They were younger, their expressions cautious as they approached. One of them, a black officer with a steady voice, spoke first. "What's going on here?" he asked, his gaze shifting between Nathan and the two officers who had called for backup. The stocky cop stepped forward, his voice shaking as he tried to explain. "We had a situation. This man was resisting and resisting." Nathan cut in, his voice calm but commanding. "Or recording." The younger officer frowned, looking at Malik, who held up the phone. "Sir, do you have footage of what happened?" he asked. Nathan nodded toward Malik. "My nephew does. He's been recording since they started targeting him." The wiry cop's face turned pale and he muttered, "This is going to ruin us." The younger officers exchanged a glance, and the black officer's jaw tightened. He turned to Nathan. "Sir, you okay? Is the boy okay?" "We're fine," Nathan replied, his tone steady. "But this isn't the first time these two have pulled something like this." "Is it?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The younger officers didn't respond, but the looks on their faces said enough. This wasn't an isolated incident, and everyone standing there knew it. Malik handed over the phone, and the black officer reviewed the footage, his expression darkening with every passing second. When he looked up, there was no hesitation in his voice. "You to turn in your badges now." The stocky officer's mouth opened to protest, but the wiry cop shook his head, defeat etched into his features. "Just do it," he muttered. The scene unfolded quickly after that. The corrupt cops were placed in handcuffs, their protest drowned out by the sound of the sirens and the whispers of bystanders who had started to gather. Nathan stood quietly, his arm around Malik, watching as the system, flawed though it was, took its first steps toward accountability. When the chaos settled, the black officer approached Nathan. "I'm sorry this happened to you," he said. "It shouldn't have." Nathan met his gaze. "It happens too often, but it doesn't have to keep happening." The officer nodded, his expression solemn. "We'll make sure the footage gets where it needs to go. And with that, Nathan and Moloch were finally free to go. But the events of that evening left a ripple that would reach far beyond a quiet road in Mississippi. As Nathan drove Moloch home, the boy broke the silence. "Uncle Nathan, are you mad?" Nathan glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his voice soft but firm. "No, Moloch. I'm proud you did the right thing today." The boy's small smile was enough to light up the dark road ahead. This story isn't just about standing up to injustice. It's about showing that true strength is found in doing what's right, no matter the cost. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire.